All right, we should be streaming now, but we usually get a little bit of delay before we know if we're streaming or not. But I'm gonna
Sure.
check here. If anybody shows up on the live chat, please let us know. I think I see it working. Let me just
Good.
check if the audio is there. All right, say something.
Bismillah, Bismillah.
All right, okay. Let me see. There's a delay. Okay, good. Everything is perfect. Okay, hi. This is
Hi.
this is Armin from Atheist Republic, and we are with.
Ismail Royer.
All right, so Ismail, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Yes, I'm an American. I am from St. Louis, Missouri. I was born and raised there, and I converted to Islam in 1992 when I was 19 years old.
Oh,
And
and so wait, you converted to Islam out of what?
well, I was raised a Catholic, went to Catholic schools. When I was about 13 years old, I started getting into the punk rock movement. And this was about 1986 or 1987. And I eventually uh, became an atheist after listening mainly to a lot of leftist punk rock, music and getting into that activist scene. And I was an atheist for many years as I was deeply involved in the leftist, left wing activism and politics. And by the time I was 18, I started feeling like I was not happy being an atheist. I didn't feel. I felt empty, and I felt somewhat alienated. I felt somewhat alone in the universe. I felt, at that time, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. So it was sort of like, here's this ideology, even though I wasn't a communist, but there was this ideology that, millions and millions of people believed in to be, the absolute gospel truth. And it turned out to be, a lie and an illusion. And so I think that also contributed to my search for some kind of truth. Um,
Right.
yeah.
So wait, you went from Catholic to atheism, and then from atheism to Islam, right?
Yes,
So
that's correct.
I'm gonna ask you a little bit more about what convinced you of each one of those. But before we do that, there's actually a lot more to you and your story. Like you're being kind of humble right now. Like you have done a lot. You have like, can you tell us a little bit about your work against? So you became a radical Muslim and then step out of that and then fought against radical Islam? Is that part of your story as well? Can you give us some details on that?
Well, so shortly after I converted to Islam, this was 1992. So this was when the war in Yugoslavia started, and we started getting these Bosnian refugees coming into St. Louis. And as a new Muslim, I was active at the mosque and was helping at the mosque to resettle these refugees that were coming into St. Louis. And there were, St. Louis turned out to be one of the major cities that these refugees were resettled in. So I became very steeped in their culture and even learned their language to some extent while I was in St. Louis. And I, at the same time, I was still interested. I was interested in the war in Afghanistan because at that time, obviously, this is we're talking about the aftermath of the Soviet invasion and then withdrawal from Afghanistan. So this was '92. There was still a lot of love and respect and honor for these Afghan and Arab mujahideen who had helped to expel the Soviets from Afghanistan. So when someone told me, and I learned that there were actually Arab fighters in Bosnia and that people could go and volunteer there, I said, oh, well, yeah, this is something I want to do. I think what happened is that I transitioned from being this activist uh, kind of leftist. When I became a Muslim, I was still in that mode, and I was also still very young, and I was very upset. I went from being very upset about the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. I went from being very upset about racism and the Rodney King beatings, and then and protesting against U.S. policy in Central America, to now I'm mad about the war in Bosnia. And frankly, it actually was something legitimate to be angry about and to be concerned about. But in my activist mode, my default was, oh, I have to do something about this. And
yeah.
yeah,
And what did you? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what I did was I got some contact information from one of the families in St. Louis for their family who was living in Slovenia. And Slovenia was a former republic of Yugoslavia, somewhat near Bosnia, very close to Bosnia. So I flew to Turkey, and that was kind of a detour. That's sort of another side story, interesting story, what I was doing in Turkey. But anyway, it had nothing to do with the war in Bosnia. And then I went to Slovenia, and from Slovenia, I met up with my contacts there, and then took the bus from Slovenia to Bosnia. And I had no idea how I was going to join up with the Arab fighters in Bosnia. But what I did was I just took the bus into a town in Bosnia called Travnik, and that's where the bus happened to stop. And it was funny because as the bus is driving through this town, and this is my first time in war. I've never been in the military had not been at that point. And, it really had the worst kind of violence I'd ever been involved in was a fist fight when I got jumped at a Taco Bell, so here I'm like, there's shelling going on. And as the bus pulls up, Bosnia is a very beautiful place, but this was a besieged town. So, there are these like little European cottages. There's this Ottoman forts and mosques around me. Excuse me. And then I'm seeing, and everyone there is European. And then I'm seeing these Arabs walking around with Kalashnikovs dressed in Afghan clothes, and it was just really exotic to me. So I got off the bus, and the bus driver took me to. He knew what I was, where I wanted to go. At that time, my language wasn't very good, and he took me to the headquarters of the Bosnian army in that town and said, this guy wants to be in the army, and he's an American. So at that time, I didn't really speak English I didn't speak Bosnian very well. I knew a few words. I do now fluently, but at that time I didn't. And so they put me, when I got there, the Bosnian Army brigade staff just had me sit in a room, and they tried to figure out what to do with me. And I was alone in this room, and this girl came, no hijab. I was expecting, I wasn't really expecting, very, very practicing people, because I knew the Bosnians in my town were sort of, most of them were fairly distant from their religion. But anyway, so this young woman comes into the room with fatigues on and short hair and no hijab or anything. And she says in English, so what are you doing here in Bosnia? And I said, well, I'm here to defend the believers against the disbelievers, And she says, well, I'm Catholic, so I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I said, I didn't mean anything. I didn't mean anything personal by that. She says, no, it's okay. But I will say that it's very interesting that people try to frame that war in terms of religion only, but in fact there were a lot of Christians on the side, Serbs and Croats on the side of the Muslims in Bosnia that were helping to defend Bosnia. And in fact, not to get sidetracked, because there's a lot of different.
Let's focus on the beliefs rather than the so.
Yeah.
So you participated in war.
Yeah, I wound up. So the Bosnian army, they sent me off to. If you were a foreigner and you were a Muslim, they would automatically just send you to a brigade that was designed for that, and that was the Mujahideen groups, that were made up of Arabs and Turks and, people who had come from Europe and so on. And so I joined them, and I received infantry training. This wasn't Al Qaeda or ISIS or something where, they're training in some sort of terrorism. This was actually infantry war, So
this was legit jihad, right?
Yes, that's right. This was much more similar to just the sort of jihad
So,
that happened in Afghanistan in the first one.
so
This had nothing.
did you kill anyone?
I can't. I don't know if I did or not, but I was in several battles. Basically, my role was that I was put on the front lines and just told to, if anyone tries to attack, shoot back. And they did. The Serbs did try, to several times to take the area that we were in, and we just shot back at them and had to put up with a lot of fire, a lot of gunfire, a lot of definitely a lot of mortars and shelling, and but I was never in any operations that were to seize land. But I was part of groups that once land had been seized, then they would put us there to hold it while the Serbs tried to take it back. So
Right.
that's the role I played in
So
the
how
military.
are you a free man now, right? Like when you go back to US, wouldn't they be like you commit? Is that was that not considered like terrorism or anything like that? No.
No, no, not at all. Because, well, first of all, as people know, the Bosnian War ended when the United States essentially started bombing, and NATO started bombing the Serbs to get them to stop fighting. And that, along with a simultaneous attack by the Bosnian army and the Croat army, essentially brought the Serbs to the negotiating table. So I was on the same side as the United States, and I didn't see
Mm.
myself as being anti-American at all. And when I came back into America after the war ended, and I was there in Sarajevo while U.S. Ships were bombing the Serbs around Sarajevo, and I watched them flying overhead and dropping bombs on the Serbs. So anyway, as I came back to the United States, no one never said anything to me.
But did you become anti-American ever or after?
Well, it's somewhat of a journey, but to put it into short terms, I after I came back from Bosnia, I think I had a hard time adjusting to normal life because I had come back from a war zone, and I came back, tried to go back to college. It was very difficult to go back to college and to listen to professors talk about poetry and so on and so on. When I had just literally like weeks before been being bombarded by Serb mortars. So I had a hard time. But I will say as well that that type of life and existence it's so charged with meaning and adventure and camaraderie and danger that it's very hard to decompress from that. And I think that that's a common experience for many people who come back from war. So I was constantly looking for to renew that, and when the war in Chechnya started, I decided I would go off the second war in Chechnya. I decided I would go to Chechnya. This was 1999. And I somehow or another, instead of going to Chechnya, I wound up in Pakistan with a Kashmiri, Pakistan-based Kashmiri group called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a very notorious group. And I decided at that time that I would decide I wouldn't go to Chechnya, but that I would help this group in their war against India. So that's how I end up. That's
What
where I
makes
wound
you
up.
decide going to these? Like, what's was your reasoning or desire to go fight in these wars?
Well, for me, it was I want to help the Muslims in areas where they're besieged. And to me, the way I saw Kashmir was as a place that was under Indian occupation. And, of course, the reality, now that I'm older, the reality is much more complicated. And, one of the big problems you see from these Western Muslims or whatever going off to fight in these areas, like, for example, the famous case of Omar Hamami, who went off, joined Al Shabaab to become even a spokesperson for them. And then he winds up getting killed after he finds out that these people are actually, dangerous lunatics. So I went off to this situation thinking that I could help, and in fact, I was so naive that I wound up being used by this group as for my qualities of being an American English speaker. And I came back and started recruiting to send people to Kashmir to train for Lashkar-e-Taiba, and I started their internet newsletter. This was 2000, so it was like very rudimentary, but
Right, but is the understanding is that one side is Muslim, the other side is not. So obviously, the Muslim side is the good side, and the non-Muslim side is the one we should be fighting for,
well,
against. Right?
yeah, yeah.
Is that how it works? Like always?
Yeah, no, it wasn't that because I definitely believed that there were cases where Muslims were wrong. So, for
Right.
example, I was very against the 97 attacks on the U.S. embassy. I was very much against, well, the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. I was very against, these types of attacks where civilians and innocent people are being killed. And I looked at it as if these people were kind of like, fringe nuts because I had not experienced those kinds of people in Bosnia. The people I was with in Bosnia, really, most of them had come from Afghanistan directly. So, the first war in Afghanistan. So these were people who, like, people who understand the history of the jihadi movement, the contemporary jihadi movement, understand that you had different strands, and you had an evolution of this ideology. So that back in the early '90s, this the Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden type of ideology actually was a minority among this. Back then the idea was where Muslims are being besieged, where Muslims are being oppressed, or where Muslims are under attack, we'll go there and we'll help defend them. So that's how I saw Kashmir. That's how I saw Chechnya. That's how I saw Bosnia.
Mm.
And yeah, that's how it
So
was.
here's the thing: why would you care about, as a Muslim? Why would you care about Muslims being oppressed more than other people being oppressed?
Well, certainly, it's not that I didn't care about other people being oppressed, because I was against all kinds of oppression, but I had a particular concern for Muslims because I myself was a Muslim, am a Muslim. So I don't think it's unusual that for your own co-religionists that you feel some heightened sense of
Isn't that a bit tribal though?
obligation. It is tribal. Certainly, it's
Mm.
tribal. Yeah,
Mm.
certainly, it's tribal. I mean, you can look at the United States and how they, in the foreign policy, the United States has been to ally more closely with democracies, for example, France, and not simply as a matter of interest, but as a matter of affinity.
So it's not you. It's not a religious duty that you think you had. Like it's not based on responding to call to jihad. It's actually based on oppression, or is that it's not? Don't you think? Doesn't your religious belief have much more to do with it?
No,
And
no, it certainly had a lot to do with it because as part of the religion, you're supposed to stand for the people who are being oppressed, and in the hierarchy of or priorities of people who are being oppressed, as a Muslim, you prioritize helping the Muslims who are oppressed, but it doesn't mean that you don't care about other people, but yeah, no, those are not contradictory. Your point that you make is exactly valid, which is that yes, responding to the cry of the oppressed Muslim to me was something that was a draw, but I mean, which was what I was drawn to for sure.
right, and you mentioned to that woman as well that you are here to fight
Right.
unbelievers, right? And
Yeah.
so, are you still trying to fight unbelievers to defend
No,
Muslims?
no. In fact, I like actually at that interaction with the Catholic Bosnian soldier was, I think. Let me put it to you this way: I have had a series of experiences in my life that eventually added up to later change my view of the world and the view of what I was my thinking, my way of thinking. So, for example, when she told me that, it was like, one of those things like, okay, maybe I'm seeing the world too simplistically. Maybe I'm seeing the world too black and white. And then later, I had about a week later, there was a Bosnian soldier who was ethnically, because this is how they see religion in the Balkans, ethnically he was a Muslim in the sense that his parents were Muslim, and but he himself, he said he didn't really believe in God at all. But he said he took me on a tour of the town of Traunik, and he says, "Do you see this monument here? That we're in the town square, and there was like a big monument." And he says this monument is to a Serb general who was fighting for the Bosnian army, and he was killed fighting against the extremist Serbs who were trying to destroy Bosnia. So he's like, so do you see, this is kind of a lesson for you as to what this is all about here. And also, by the way, so before I went to Bosnia, I had this sort of like Salafi outlook, and then I'm mostly with a lot of Sufis, most of the Bosnians are Sufis. So I'm like meeting these Sufis, and I'm like, okay, well, so maybe I've got some, two black and white ways of looking at the world. Now, I won't, those types of experiences did not add up to influence me until years later, and years later, I looked back and reflected, and I was like, I'm really looking at this the wrong way. I mean, and I'll give you another example of something that, made me change my way of thinking was when Lashkar-e-Taiba attacked Mumbai, and they carried out this horrible atrocity. Well, before that, I was I was sympathetic to Lashkar-e-Taiba, even after I was, as I'll explain to the listeners, even after I was arrested for supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba, I still in my mind was thinking, well, but they're just fighting Indian occupation, and this is sort of overkill from the government and locking me up. But then they go and they carry out this attack, and they had told me that they were against this type of thing on a religious basis. They were against attacking civilians. Well, here they went and carried out one of the worst atrocities that have ever been carried out in the name of Islam in the contemporary times. So it made me I felt like I had been betrayed, and I had gone to prison to help these people, and they did this act that I totally was against.
Why were you against it? Isn't it justified religiously?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You can't just. What these people did was they took military weapons and went into train stations. They went into restaurants. They went into a synagogue, a Jewish prayer hall, and which is forbidden in Islam to attack religious people. So to me, what Lashkar-e-Taiba did in Mumbai was an absolute
not
disgrace.
Forbidden to kill Ahlul Kitab, not all religious people.
No, it's forbidden to kill people who are not fighting, and what these people did was they went and they killed people who were sitting having tea with military weapons. To me, that's cowardice. To me, that's unmanly. To me, it's a disgrace. To me, it's violating what our religion teaches. So
you were Salafi and then you weren't, right? So going back, like what are some mistakes you made, and what do you think changed your mind that made you think that these you shouldn't have done those?
So as I mentioned, there were a few of these sort of incidents that sort of lodged in my mind, and later as I look back and reflected. But the big incident that changed my way of thinking was 9/11. And 9/11, I was working in Washington D.C. at the time, and I passing by the Pentagon every day. And when 9/11 happened, first of all, I was traumatized by it because it was such a terrible to me. I mean, a terrible disgrace to the name of Islam. And I was at that time part of a group of young men in the Washington D.C. area who used to get together to play paintball, to go hiking and hunting. And in this group of people, I was using this group of people as a pool of recruits to send them to go off to join Lashkar-e-Taiba or to train with them. And because again, I have to say that this was part of my idea of I'm supporting Muslims who are oppressed or whatever. And I didn't have in my mind that I was against the United States. Well, when 9/11 happened, one of the people that I had sent over actually happened to be in Kashmir at that time, training when 9/11 happens. So I was panicking. I was against the attacks, but at the same time, I'm feeling now like kind of, what side am I on? You know what I mean? There's sort of like a dual loyalty thing going on, because in my mind, the way that, okay, when you're living a life that sees the world as divided up into two eternally competing sides, okay, the believers and the unbelievers, and when you are, even if you can like sort of like square the circle and say to yourself, well, okay, I'm an American, I'm living peacefully, and so
You mean
on
like
here.
Darul Harb and Darul Islam?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And if you say to like, so being an American, I didn't see myself as being in conflict with the United States. I had a lot of obviously disagreement with many of the things the United States government did, but I didn't see myself in conflict. But when something like 9/11 happens, it's a test for you to say, like, now, if that's your mentality, and something like 9/11 happens, even if you don't agree with 9/11, even if you don't agree with even if you don't agree with that, now you're being almost put into a position to decide, what are you going to do? And so we had a group meeting, and we got together and discussed this was like 3 days after 9/11, and a local scholar came and talked to us and gave us some advice in this private meeting at our friend's house. And he said, look, it doesn't matter whether you agree with 9/11 or not. What matters is that it happened. And now you see the world dividing up between the Muslims over here and the non-Muslims over here are arranging their forces against the Muslims. So even if you don't like Al-Qaeda, even if you didn't agree with 9/11, the real question is, which side are you going to be on? You might not agree with Al-Qaeda, but they're Muslims at least, so you're going to have to decide what side you're on.
Wait,
Well,
who was telling you this?
this was a local scholar. I'd rather not get
Oh,
into that, but anyway,
an American Muslim scholar.
yeah, he was. I don't want to
Jesus.
say. I mean,
Yeah.
he's in prison now, so for this
Good.
actual meeting. So,
All right.
well,
All right.
so
Yeah.
anyway, so
But okay. But
I mean,
did you
look,
agree? Did you agree with him at that point? Sorry. Like, what
well,
were
at
your
that,
views? Yeah.
yeah, at that time. And by the way, you said good. I think that I think whether someone gets a life in prison is it's questionable whether someone deserves life for that kind of thing. But clearly, it was wrong what he said. And no, but at the time, I suddenly felt, oh, okay, well now it's clarified to me. Now, okay, I don't like 9/11, but I do want to be with the Muslims. I do want to, I don't want to be against the Muslims. So his advice was, everyone needs to. He didn't say like go join Al Qaeda. He just said, my advice to you guys is, if you can, then leave the United States. And so after the meeting, the friends who were there, they came to me and they said, hey, can you help us get to Pakistan? Can you help us go join Lashkar-e-Taiba? And so I said, yeah, let's go. And so I went to the phone and went to a payphone and called and said, yeah, these guys want to come join you. And they said, okay, send them. So it's about 5 of those guys went off, and I left the United States as well. I went to Bosnia, and those guys went to Pakistan, intending to join Lashkar-e-Taiba. So they went off. I went off after about, well, this is the point that I was driving at, is that when I got to Bosnia, and I got off the plane, and I took the bus to my wife's city. My wife at that time, my ex-wife, my then wife, was Bosnian, and I flew to her town. And this town was where I had been in the war, and I had a lot of friends there and a lot of support there. So I went to this town, and that's where I was going to try to make my new life. And as I got
Wait.
off the bus, yeah,
Wait. So
as I got off the,
we jumped back to history, right?
yeah,
Like this
yeah.
is way before what we were just talking about, right? Like.
No,
Yeah.
no, this is after 9/11, but
Okay.
I had a lot of support and a lot of friends in Bosnia from, the
Oh.
time of the war, so
Okay.
that's
So
where I
you went
went.
back
Yeah,
to Bosnia again. Okay.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Go.
In responding to the advice of this guy for us to leave the United States and go to the Muslim world. So as I got off the bus, I immediately, the first people that I saw were two friends who had been high-level officials in the Mujahideen brigade during the war in Bosnia. They were Bosnians, but they were high-level officials connected to the Arabs who had been there at that time. So they were close friends of mine, and they were people that I very much respected and admired. So they said to me, Ismail, what are you doing in Bosnia? It was like at that point, it was about 3 weeks after 9/11, and they were surprised to see me. And I said, well, we may not like the 9/11 attacks, but, we have to decide what side we're on. And so I decided to come here and be with the Muslims. So they looked at each other and like rolled their eyes, and they said, hey, look, Ismail, let's go have coffee, and talk. So I was like, okay, so we went and talked. And they told me, first of all, they said, look, 9/11 was evil. And what these people did, these guys didn't ask us in Bosnia if this was going to be good for the Muslims in Bosnia. They just went off and did this from their, caves in Afghanistan, and thought that it was a good idea, but they didn't ask us. And also, they said, look, the brother said, he said, if I robbed the bank and then the police surrounded it, and I called you and said, Ismail, I need you to come help me out. The police are surrounding the bank. What would you say? And I'd say, well, you were crazy. And he said, exactly. He said, that's these people's situation. He said, these people, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they made their bed. They need to lie in it. They need to deal with the consequences. This has nothing to do with you. And also one of them made this point. He said, so is the sheikh who told you this going to go as well? Is he going to leave the United States too? And what was funny about that was, like, in my mind, I was like, oh man, no, because actually what he was doing was he was back in the United States finishing his PhD, So here I am, I dropped everything. There's all of us five dropped everything and we left. And I basically was a fool. And the reason I was open to this type of, let's say, like, manipulation and foolish judgment is because of the mentality that I had of us versus them, and that's a very dangerous mentality. What's called the wala wal bara, which is a real thing in Islam. It means like loyalty to the Muslims, and bara, which means like disassociation or disloyalty to non-Muslims.
And this is Islamic. This is part.
Well, there is something like this in Islam, but it has been distorted and manipulated and exaggerated by the extremists. And in reality, what it really means.
But I want to continue your story, though. I don't want to get too much into theology right now. Yeah.
Sure. So anyway, I'm now at this point, I'm sitting in Bosnia. I had brought my wife and my kids to Bosnia, and I was feeling like an idiot, and I stayed in Bosnia for about 8 months or so until I realized that, I should go back home to America. So I came back to America.
So you didn't do any fighting before you?
No. Right. I just actually what I was doing there was.
So you got lucky with those guys, because this time around, if you did any fighting, then you'll be on a terrorist list right now, wouldn't you be?
Well, that's precisely right. And well, as it happens, when I came back to the United States, in April 2002, and I started a website that was against extremism called atrueword.com. The name A True Word comes from a hadith that the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, he said, the best jihad is a true word against an unjust ruler. So I called this, myself and a couple of my friends, we called this website atrueword.com, and we wrote against extremism on the one hand, but we also were writing to promote what we saw as actually like the true Islam, and as we saw it, and as I continue to see it, the true Islam actually intends good for everyone, and is not divided into this sort of hostile camps.
Right. So here's a question: how do you respond to the claim that the appeal of these terrorist groups or any other militant Islamic group um, it's mostly political, and it's not Islam that is responsible for making people join these groups. It's just political and has nothing to do with Islam. Do you think Islam is somehow responsible for getting somebody like you, consider joining groups like this?
I think this is an excellent question. This is my answer to that, and I've done a lot of thinking and writing on this issue. My answer to that is that there are concepts in Islam that, if seen in isolation and taken out of context and exaggerated, and if those concepts are taken and all the other balancing elements are eliminated, then what you wind up with is something that is called Islam and looks like it is derived from Islam, but in reality it's a deformed version of Islam. So what I believe is that and you can take any ISIS magazine, and I've studied ISIS's writings a great deal, and Al Qaeda writings, and the people whose thought those things are based on, like Sayyid Qutb and others.
I mean, Qutb knew his shit, right?
No, but see, these people had ideas that were, in many cases, foreign to the religion, or misunderstandings of the religion. And what happens is that these ideas, when you take them in isolation and you exaggerate them and you separate them from the other balancing elements, you wind up with something very poisonous.
So,
Yeah.
two things. First, as a former Muslim myself, when I read the Quran, nobody told me that these verses tell you that we need to go to war, right?
Right.
I read them, and to me, it seems like we need to start going to war with non-believers, right? And this wasn't based on some people. Like, I read them cover to cover. I read the stories. I read Muhammad's stories. It seemed like it's basically, to me, it seemed like it was suggesting that, yeah, we need to go war with the Kafiruns and anybody that is against Allah in any way. But just when I'm in Iran and I'm reading the Quran and Hadith and the Tafsir and everything else, not just like in isolation, with the context, with the story, with the commentary, with all of that. To me, it seems like it's that our government, as much as other people think like it's as too authoritarian and too aggressive, to me it seemed like it's not aggressive enough. It's not being Islamic enough. Like, it seemed like, why are we not why is this government it seems like it says it's an Islamic republic, but it needs to be even more aggressive based on what I'm reading in the Quran and Hadith. And this is not based on, and this is me just reading this book, reading the Hadith. This is not based on some alt-right groups trying to misrepresent some quote-unquote Islamophobes, which is a term I don't like, but we could get into that later, trying to misrepresent to Islam to me. This is me just reading the Quran and the Hadith, right? And like, I remember in Iran, for example, I remember in a private religion class that we had for university entrance preparation exam, I remember, for example, we were going over some verses in the Quran, and this girl just starts crying, right? And just because of reading the verses in the Quran about a woman, right? And this is not we are not in an environment that is meant to brainwash us to say Islam is anti-woman. This is an environment that we are brainwashed to say Islam is pro-woman. Right? That the heaven is underneath of the mother's feet and all that stuff, right? Yet when she's reading the Quran, she starts crying based on how she thinks the Quran is talking about women. So either these, you were a Muslim and you were reading these verses, and at some point you were convinced that this is the right thing to do, right? I mean, doesn't the text hold some don't you think it has holds some responsibility for advocating these kind of belief systems, or you think it's completely everything is completely separate from Islam? Anybody doing anything like this, anybody being anti-woman, anybody being committing violence unjustly in the name of Islam, there's nothing within the text or scripture or the hadith that is at all responsible for this. They're completely misrepresenting Islam, all of them.
No, what I believe is that so there the Prophet Muhammad said he said you do not, excuse me, this is one of his companions. He said if you relate
Which companion? Do you know?
I believe it was Ibn Mas'ud. I believe
Okay.
he said just a rough translation. He said um, he said you can relate a hadith or a statement or some discourse to someone whose mind cannot handle it, and then it will wind up being a fitna for them, meaning a trial and a test for them.
Oh.
Okay, so there are
So
many
this is
different versions.
this is a very Salafi thing to refer to companions, rather, like the people that lived with during the time of Muhammad.
Right,
They were
right,
seen as the most trustworthy people to refer to, right? But just let's go to the directly to the source, to the both to the hadith and the Quran, right? If you read those, I mean, for example, right? Let's say the verses that say we must fight all kafirun, right? So the excuses
right,
for that was like, okay, this was just at that specific war at that time. This
right.
was an armed battle. This is not referring to that we should always fight kafirun, But
Right.
I mean, to the example I give to that, I mean, there's so many examples. I mean, you could go over every single one of them. I mean, the wife beating, the capturing women in war, the crucifying people that spread corruption on earth. I mean, I'm spreading corruption on earth, right? This is the verse that is telling you that if you kill one, so you Muslims a lot of time talk about context and us taking things out of context, but then they always, for example, mention the verse that says killing one person is like killing all humankind, and they don't mention the verse right after that it says that you're supposed to even Obama quoted that, remember? But they don't mention the verse after that says that you're supposed to crucify people that spread corruption on earth. And by I think I'm based according to Islam, I'm spreading corruption on earth more than most people. So I should be crucified according to the Quran. And I mean, with regards to the verses that says that you should be killing, imagine if there was some enemies that we were attacking, and we're not attacking them because they're Jewish, but they just happen to be Jew, right? Just
Mhm.
happen to be Jew, right? So
Right.
for this is the excuse people get for attacking the Kafirun. It's not like Muhammad is not saying kill all unbelievers. These people that they're attacking, they happen to be unbelievers. But imagine if this general said like, we must kill the Jews. Like, you would be like, what the fuck are you talking about? What kind of language is that? You're like, no, but well, those people are Jews. Yeah, well, yeah, but this is, first of all, if you say we must attack the Jews, it seems to me that we're attacking them because they're Jews. One. Second of all, if you know that your word is now going to be written somewhere and is going to be used as a model to follow for all humans at all time, maybe don't say stuff like we must attack all the Jews, right? We must defeat the Jews. Maybe say something like we must defeat these people at this village at this time because they attacked us before, just like, and they took our stuff, right? So maybe don't refer to them like that. So when when the Quran says like we must defeat all the kafiruns and everything, now, and this is a book that is supposed to be used as a role model for all time, I'm included in that. Like I'm the kafirun, I'm the kafir here, I'm the mulhead, I'm the murtad, I'm the kafir, I'm all of those things, right? And don't you think there are these? I mean, you know how we did when we go on Twitter and some people use a phrase in a way that might be
Sorry.
interpreted. No, that's okay. Might be
Yeah.
interpreted in a way that people will be like, maybe if you didn't mean that, maybe be more careful about your wording. Like, imagine the text in the Quran is so aggressive against large groups of people that the amount of excuses that we find, that a lot of apologists find for it, would never be accepted in any other form. I mean, at the best you could say if all of the stuff that I'm reading in the Quran, they're not supposed to be anti-woman, they're not supposed to be violent, then can they're not supposed to be promoting slavery, then we can at least admit that if none of that was meant to be there, then it was written very poorly, right? But anyways, I talk too much. Can you go on?
No, I wanted to let you say what you had to say.
Yeah.
So obviously, there's a lot of places to begin with those things, but I think your underlying point. Look, let me say this: that I personally have arrived at my understanding of my religion, through the book, through the Quran, and through the sayings of the Prophet, and through the understanding of those texts that is given to me by the qualified scholars. So this isn't what I'm talking to you now about. I'm not talking to you about like to try to like apologize, like you said, like apologetics or something
Right,
like
right,
that.
right. Okay.
But what I'm explaining to you, like sort of how I saw through my my distorted understanding of the religion, and how I arrived at an understanding of my religion that doesn't put me in, eternal conflict with, the half of humanity that doesn't believe what I believe. I believe that I definitely believe that those who I believe that those who believe that there are many gods other than God, and they die and they didn't have an excuse for that belief, I do believe that they're going to hell. And I do believe that those who committed sins and even and so on, and they disbelieved in God and his oneness, that they'll go to hell for that. But that doesn't mean that I can't live. That doesn't mean that I can't live in harmony and peace and cooperate for goodness. And it doesn't mean that those who believe other than me don't have the right to live and flourish and be respected. So to me, this is what my religion teaches me. And all the verses that she mentioned in terms of, for example, slay the disbeliever wherever you find them, and so on. To me, the proper explanation of that is that's not just some way to make Islam look good. The proper explanation of that was given by actual classical scholars. And when I went back and read those scholars, and I read what they actually had to say, and I saw that my understanding of my religion was actually coming from like a narrow little sliver of the actual, teachings and the actual perspective. I changed my way of looking at things. So I believe that that this religion, it teaches us, like the Prophet Muhammad said, God created Adam in the image of the most merciful. The Prophet Muhammad said that, most merciful being God. And for that reason, he said, for example, if you're fighting with someone, then don't hit their face. Why? Because the
if you're fighting a Muslim, right?
If you're fighting anyone, if you're fighting anyone, then
just to be clear, the amount of hadith that is out there is so much that it's impossible not to find some good advice and a lot of ridiculous stuff out there as well.
Let me say that one of the problems
there's so much hadith that if I point to, that are like, some of them are like, at least most people will find batshit crazy. Like, which ones I'm referring to, right? Like,
let me say this, that it is a mistake for the Muslim, let alone the non-Muslim. It's a mistake for the Muslim to go grab a collection of hadith and just start reading it and trying to apply it, and because first of all, he has to have the correct understanding of that. You can't just take something and misapply it, because every hadith has to be understood in the context of the Quran. It has to be understood in the context of the other hadith. So
That's what they say. As that's why the people that disagree with you, Muslims that disagree with you, say as well. They say exact same thing.
no, you're correct. I've had this conversation with people where they'll say, "Oh, you're taking it out of context. You're saying where the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion, but you're taking out of context from other things, you know." But what I say is that they're taking it out of context, you know,
Okay.
you know,
To,
and but here's the thing. I believe that my understanding of my religion
mm,
is properly in line with the underlying goals and the underlying principles of this religion. And so, if you look at someone who says, "Oh no, the Quran says that we can blow up churches," and the Hadith say we can blow up churches, and the scholars say we can blow up churches, for example, and I say, "Well, hold on a minute, but that's not in line with the underlying principles that this religion stands for, and so therefore that interpretation is wrong."
right.
And so you can't tell me you're taking that out of I'm taking that out of context. You're taking that out of context.
So
You know?
to me, the problem is that there's so much scripture and there's so much. There's some things that are very clear and some things that are so vague, and just to be fair, there's a lot of clear parts there as well. But that you could take whatever you want out of the religion like this. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And to me,
So,
it's
so, 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 I'm sorry to interrupt. There, for example, you're familiar with the story of the Khawarij, or the concept of the Khawarij.
yes.
They were that group that
Yeah, Ali Muawiyah
rebelled.
were in war, and they were at
Right,
Ali's
right,
side, and Ali betrayed them. They think Ali betrayed them, so yeah, they're the
right. So,
yes, I understand. You think they're the first terrorists. They're the ones that ISIS follows, but
right.
they don't think that by themselves. They think they're following the Rashidun.
Of course they do, because they're deluded by Satan.
But that's what they say about you.
But no, but what I was trying to say was that, so when the Khawarij, these people first came out and they declared Ali to be a disbeliever, and they declared Muawiyah to be a disbeliever. These companions of the Prophet, and Ali being the cousin of the Prophet, and so they waved a verse of the Quran. They said this verse. They said, whoever judges by other than God, then he is a disbeliever, or whatever. So Ali
Takfir. They
said,
started takfiring people.
right. So Ali said this. Ali said, a word of truth in the service of falsehood. So this is a very important concept, which is that you can take any verse from the Quran. I mean, for example, there's one place in the Quran where it says that the disbelievers on the Day of Judgment will have blue eyes. Be blue-eyed. Is what it says literally. So the Nation of Islam, which is a group that is a heretical sect, they say, "Oh, see, that means that white people are the devils. White people are evil." But they're misinterpreting it. They're taking that out of context. Well, all this is to say
Hmm.
that someone can preserve their religion and preserve their understanding, and not wind up in some sort of satanic sect that has broken off, and that is causing that is basically the enemy of the Muslims, the enemy of all of humanity, as ISIS and Al Qaeda are, for example. Someone can avoid that by taking their religion from qualified scholars, and not by going off and trying to interpret the religion themselves, by grabbing hadith by themselves, and not by following people who are by consensus a deviant group.
So it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, because a lot of Muslims say that they're looking at the scripture and the hadith, and they're coming to the conclusion that this is how the way they're supposed to live. But to me, it seems like it's the other way around. Muslims and other religious people, they come to the conclusion that this is how they're supposed to live, and then they go to scripture and they try to find the justification with their newfound belief system, right?
Okay,
So it seems
brilliant point. Let me just stop you right there, because I want to say that I actually agree with you, and in a sense, and where I stopped in my story is a good place to restart, which
okay.
is that after I came back to the United States, and I mentioned that I'd started this website that was trying to promote a healthy understanding of this religion, and the sound understanding of this religion. Well, I was arrested about a year and a half after coming back to the United States. The FBI had investigated why did this group of young men go off to Pakistan. I mean, what the heck is going on here? And so I was arrested. I was charged with trying to support Al Qaeda, trying to
by
support the
FBI.
Taliban.
You were okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was charged in 2003, and I was charged with treason against the United States for attempting to support Al Qaeda and so on. And I was charged with so many different charges that I would have gone to prison for life if I had been convicted of all of those. So I pleaded guilty to two weapons charges, and I was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That's in 2003. So I was released about a year and a half ago. I was in prison for 13 and a half years. And in that time, I was in prison with mostly with people of other terrorism related cases, because they kept us actually for 7.5 years. They kept us isolated with one another. So I was in ADX in Florence, Colorado, at the Supermax prison. I was in different units like that. So in those units, I had an opportunity to debate with people like Richard Reed, the shoe bomber who attempted to blow up the plane right after 9/11 with the bomb in his shoe. He was sent by Al Qaeda, and other people like that, people involved in the first World Trade Center bombing. Many of these people, by the way, had at this point changed their way of thinking as well. And we used to, these units are very interesting because they wound up being divided into groups on the one hand who were against extremism and terrorism and so on, and then on the other hand, people who were continued to hold those beliefs. And there was a lot of tension and sometimes violence between these groups in prison, which was very strange. But anyway, my point being that I came to the conclusion that there is a certain type of person who has a diseased heart. This is a person who believes that the world has treated him unfairly. He believes that the world owes him something. He believes that everyone else is crazy and he's the only one who's sound. He's the only one who's a good person. And this type of person, when they come across the ideology of the Islamist extremist ideology, and many of the Muslim listeners who are listening to this will be upset about the term Islamist extremist, but I have a reason for saying that. I believe that that's a useful term. But in any event, if you don't like that term, if they don't like that term, the religious extremist, ideology, they're attracted to that because it ennobles and gives some justification for that sick, diseased personality that they already have. And so they find something that resonates with that. So I'll give you an example. There was this guy who was in prison he was a Jordanian kid. He was in prison for attempting to send laptop computers to Al Qaeda in Iraq. And he used to just go around, for example, changing the TV when other people were watching the TV. Or taking someone's food out of the microwave and putting his own food in the microwave. And I asked him one time, I said, why do you act like this? And he's like, oh, this is from the izzah of the Muslims. This is from the honor of the believers, I'm like, no, you're just a bully and you're trying to justify to yourself why you're doing that. And so he used to do that a lot. Now, I was in a psychology group class with him, a therapy group, and we were required in prison to attend these types of group therapy sessions. So the prison psychologist is there, and I'm in this group with this therapy group with some very interesting people. Every single one of their stories is its own story in itself. So this Jordanian kid is in there, and the psychologist told us, to come to the next session with some example of a conflict we had been in our personal lives that was our own fault, that we had contributed to. And the purpose of that was for us to begin to realize that we were not in prison because people had been unjust to us. We were in prison because we had contributed in some way to our situation. Now, I will say that there are actually a lot of people who are in prison for unjust reasons. There's no question about that. But for most of it, most people in prison, frankly, they've done something to get to where they're at. So I came to the next session with some example of a conflict that I had been in with a fellow prisoner that really I could have avoided by not behaving a certain way. And by the way, I think all human beings fall into this. We can get into a road rage incident and say, oh, this guy, he cut me off or this whatever, but we don't think to ourselves, how did I react to that in a way that I could have avoided? Anyway, this Jordanian kid comes in and says, I have never been in any conflict in my life that was my fault. It has always been because people disagreed with my Islamic principles. Well, I can tell you right now that not a single conflict that I had seen him in the year that I was in there with him had anything to do with Islamic principles. It was all his petty, nasty, low-life personality that was causing him to come into conflict with other human beings. And I'm sorry to keep on talking about it, but anyway, I gave him a copy of a book one time. He asked me, he said, Ismail, why do people hate me? And I said, people hate you because you're a nasty person. And I said, you need to work on your soul. You need to work on your heart. And I gave him a copy of a book called Madarij al-Salikin by a scholar called Ibn al-Qayyim, a great scholar, lived many hundred years ago. But this book is essentially a manual on how to purify your heart from the diseases of jealousy and pettiness and so on and so on. Well, anyway, so what happened is that I gave him this book, and he says, oh, yeah, I know about this book. I teach this to my students all the time.
Okay.
Well, it's like, so in other words, I told him, no, don't read this book as a means of blowing your student's mind with the deep thoughts in this. I said, you need to read this book, brutally, being brutally honest with yourself, looking in the mirror and asking yourself, how am I guilty of this? How does this apply to me? I say all that to say that I actually agree with you. I agree with you that there is a certain type of person who comes to a religion with a preconceived heart. And by the way, there's a person who comes to the religion with a good heart and with a sound heart.
Right.
And this kind of person will see in the religion, he'll see the beauty in it, he'll see the truth in it, and he won't take a distorted version of it.
So how do you know that's because the religion is not is messed up? Maybe it's because the person is a good person and they're just trying to make the religion match their personality and match what they want. How do you know that you're not doing the same thing?
Because a good person, and I'm not calling myself a good person, but I will say that I don't have the level of sickness, of the soul that these people had by God's permission and by God's grace. But I'm constantly in fear of that, and that's actually the point. When a person is in constant vigilance over his heart and constant fear of falling into the diseases of pettiness and jealousy and bullying and getting joy out of seeing people hurt and these types of sicknesses. When a person who doesn't have that in his heart and he comes to the religion, which itself, by the way, this religion itself is in line with the inherent better angels of our nature, as it's been said, then they will get out of this religion something beautiful. But if someone comes to this religion with a sickness in their heart, then they will see the verses in a sick light, and in a distorted light in the same way that their soul is distorted, and that's what they'll walk
So
away with.
it's almost as if the religion has nothing to do with it. It's
No,
almost
it's. I
it's
would
all
not. I don't say that
no,
because
but
the
just
reason.
let me just say
Yeah,
but
yeah,
you're coming with the assumption that Islam is good and pure. So
yeah.
naturally, a good person with a good heart is getting the right interpretation from it, rather than a person that his heart is diseased or whatever, right? But that's, I mean, but then when you're trying to see if Islam is pure and correct, you're only referring to people that maybe you see that they are good people, and you're seeing their interpretation of what they have in the Quran. But then the reason, as you acknowledge, might be because of who they are, not because of what Islam is. Maybe their version of Islam is a better version because they're better people, not because Islam is a good religion.
This the interpretation or the understanding of the religion that um, I think most people would universally see as good and sound. For example, the principle that I have to love for my neighbor what I love for myself. I mean, anyone who doesn't believe that, they're a sociopath, really.
Wait, I
You know
have
what I
to
mean?
wait. So I think
Yeah,
I'm a sociopath then, because I
yeah.
should love my neighbor as much as I love myself.
We should love for our neighbors what we love for ourselves. If I,
See, this
if
is
I want.
so this is Christianity, okay? So you're
Yes, that is was said by quoted by Jesus in the Bible, but it's all and other places. But it's also the Prophet Muhammad said it.
so
The
these
Prophet
are
Muhammad said, "Anyone, you are not a believer unless you love for your neighbor what you want for
See,
yourself."
this is why I don't like religious moral, even the so-called good parts, because they're so simplistic and they usually don't are not very effective. I mean, obviously we all have different needs and desires. What's good for me is not necessarily good for you. If I want to serve the society, I better understand people's different needs and desires, instead of just assuming what is good for me is good for them. But that
No, no, no.
but
That's not what that means. But
but
anyway, that's a different.
yeah,
That's a
I'm
different
just
question.
saying,
But
like, the amount of nuance in the so-called good parts of the Quran or the Bible um are not, they're not very nuanced at all. They're very The good parts are very simplistic, fuzzy, make you feel good about your religion parts of the religion that better philosophers have talked about, you know moral, the best way to have moral codes, thousands of years before the Bible or the Quran, in much more advanced ways. But that would be a debate. That would be a very long debate. So don't you think? So a lot of the explanations that people have for the verses in the Quran, when people like me criticize the
mhm.
Quran,
Yeah.
a lot of those explanations, um, what I ask is, like, wouldn't it be good if that was in the Quran? Like, the Quran itself challenges us to bring a document, bring a writing better than it, right? So
Right,
when I
right.
ask, for example, oh, this verse tells you that if your wife is not obedient to you, first you don't talk to her, then you abandon her from your bed, and then if she still doesn't listen to you, then you beat her, right? And I think, and people that you fear disobedience, women that your wives that you fear disobedience from, and we would say, well, that's fucking bullshit. That's barbaric. And people, there's so many different responses to this. Most of the responses is that the beating is a light beating, but then recently, very recently, compared to how long Islam has been around, some people are trying to make an excuse that this doesn't even mean beat your wife, which is nonsense. Anybody that knows anything about Arabic could see that it actually does mean beat your wife. But the thing is, whatever excuses they have, um, it would have been great if the Quran had clarified that. Right, that would have been an improvement. Like, wouldn't you agree that if the Quran had one verse saying we shouldn't own other human beings, slavery is wrong, that would have made it a better book. That if the verse that says about wife beating was not there, it wouldn't have that would have been a better book. If all the clarifications regarding, oh, defeating all the kafirun until all religion is for Islam. If all the excuses for that, for why that's not a violent, barbaric verse, I'm not gonna go over the justifications with you right now. But if those, don't you think it's not a very, if that's what it meant, then it should have been there in the book somewhere. Like we have human documents, instructions. Like the manual for my microwave is more clear than the Quran, right? And I think that, people wrote documents that is really easy to follow, very clear. But this is apparently you need like an committee of scholars to be able to decode, to be able to get one simple message out of it. But go on.
Well, I would say that it's, as you acknowledged, there are verses that are clear and there are verses that are not clear. And the Quran itself says that. And it also says that those in whose hearts is a deviation will follow those verses that are not clear. And the Quran was intended to be read in light of the explanation of the Prophet Muhammad about these verses. I mean, that's what he was sent for, to clarify for the people the meaning of the Quran. And the purpose of the scholars is to clarify what the meaning of the Quran was and clarify the meaning of the Prophet's words.
It was never mentioned that we need scholars. It mentioned that the community of Muslims, maybe they never come to an agreement that is wrong, right?
But no, it does say in the Quran to ask those with knowledge if you don't know something, and so we are told to ask those people who know more than we do.
Yeah, but the question, but that's not exactly the same thing. Obviously, okay. Yeah, but I'm just saying that, first of all, how do you know all these scholars? First of all, disagree with each other. How do you know that you're referring to the right scholar?
Okay, so what you would say, first of all, there are some people who claim scholarship or who are commonly referred to as scholars who, in fact, are not scholars, and that that no one should listen to, or by the way, who are people who are qualified in one area, but who made mistakes in other areas, and so their opinions should not be followed in those other areas.
Made mistakes according to you.
Well, I definitely concede that someone from ISIS is going to say that, well, actually, it's you who are mistaken, and it's not us who are mistaken. I acknowledge that. But what I will say, once again, I'm going to return to the fact that, to the point that, I'll give you an example. Okay, so I recently published this monograph here on this paper.
Oh, what is that?
Pakistan's blasphemy law.
And bring up, you're covering the title.
Oh, sorry.
Pakistan. Okay, so you have you wrote this book. Oh, yeah. Pakistan's. No, keep it up. I want to.
Okay, sorry.
Pakistan's blasphemy law and non-Muslims by Ismail Royer.
Right.
Okay,
exactly.
So that's okay. Cool.
So to take this issue as an example. Okay,
Did I pronounce your last name right? Royer?
That's correct. Yeah. Okay, that's correct. So in Pakistan, they have a law that says that if you insult the Prophet Muhammad, you get the death penalty. And there are about 50% of the people who are charged under this law are Christians, and Christians make up like 4% of the population. So this law is supposedly, it was passed during the dictatorship of Zia al-Haq, as he's known, and he introduced these laws into the I said dictatorship. I mean the military rulership. That's less less pejorative, more neutral. But he introduced these laws, and these laws are supposed to be based on Islamic sources and Islamic law. Now, it's certainly true that there are scholars who said that if a non-Muslim Christian or whatever insults the Prophet, then he is to be killed for that. And that's true, that there are scholars who said that. Now, there are also scholars who said, no, if a non-Muslim insults the Prophet, then it doesn't, that's not something that is to be punished, because he already doesn't believe in Islam, and that's accepted in our religion, that because we don't force people to believe things, and we accept that there are people who believe things other than we do, and so therefore their insults of the Prophet are something that
Do
they're
you
not
believe
punished
in the
for.
story of Muhammad, the part of the story of Muhammad that when he came back to capture Mecca, he had a list of people that were supposed to be put to death,
Right.
including poets that made fun of him?
Okay, so I covered that exact issue is covered heavily in this book. Why? Because this is one of the things that that Pakistan's law is actually based on,
Mm.
is on this these narrations like this. But it's not that simple because first of all, yeah, it's not that simple. Now let me let
It seems to me like you have a harder job convince
yeah.
showing that these stories and hadith and sunnah and the verses Quran don't
Right.
apply, and they
Mm-hmm.
have an easier job making a direct line between Muhammad's life and their justification for what they're doing. It seems like their job is a lot easier. It seems like Islam has made their job a lot easier than your job. But go on.
I would say to that you know, I would say to that if you look at this, my treatment of this issue, this is just an example, right? So you can, it is true that there are very highly respected scholars, if not even the majority, who said that a non-Muslim who insults a prophet is to be killed. And then if you look at the opinion of the scholars who said no, he's not. So how can I say which one is right in this situation? Okay, I can't say that categorically. First of all, I'm not qualified to do that because I'm not of that level of
So you
knowledge.
might
But
be
I can't.
wrong. Can you admit that you might be wrong about it?
Well, here's where I'm not wrong. Where I'm not wrong is that it is not mandatory for this non-Muslim to be killed because there is no agreement among the scholars for that. And when
Muhammad
there,
did it. You have to follow
no,
the way of Muhammad.
no,
It's sunnah.
okay, but there's no agreement that this is a mandatory thing to be done in this situation. And because there's no agreement on this mandatory thing to be done, we can see that in fact this law results in a great deal of harm. It results in a great deal of harm in the sense that it is causing internal strife in Pakistan between Christians and Muslims. It's causing Pakistani Christians to be oppressed and for their rights to be violated. And in general, it's a harmful law, and so therefore the law should not be applied to non-Muslims. And so this is an example. This is an example of the type of thing where you say, all right, well, here's these scholars over here who are legitimate scholars, but they should not be followed because that opinion is, as applied in this situation in Pakistan, is resulting in harm. Whereas if we are to follow the scholar who is that's those scholars who disagreed with that and said no, they shouldn't be punished, then that would result in good.
You're focusing too much on harm in dunya rather than akhirat. You're focusing. They would say like harm in this life is not as important as focusing on harm in afterlife. You're too
It,
obsessed with dunya. You're too
it,
obsessed with this life.
no, it's certainly true that the after the hereafter and the destination that we go to is something that is considered a good in Islam. It's something
So
that is considered a benefit. But at the same time, Islam is also concerned with preserving life. It's concerned with preserving justice. So we have to balance. Okay, we have to balance. Our behavior in this world. So for the question is it helping? Is it helping to advance the purpose of this religion by having this law? No, it's not. And
what
so
is the
therefore it
purpose
shouldn't
of
be.
this religion?
Well, this religion has the scholars by agreement.
It seems like you're referring more to this is what I noticed. A lot of the
Yeah,
so-called modern Muslims, they're more obsessed with scholars than Muhammad and the Quran himself.
because we cannot ourselves go to the Quran and go to the Prophet Muhammad with our limited understandings. We have to
So
understand these.
The Quran is not written for the average person. God could not come up with the simple enough instructions for people with simple minds to be able to understand it. You have to
That
there needs to be some other people that, but here's the thing, if you can't,
no, no,
no,
no, no, no. Just a second. Just a second.
let
Just
me,
a second.
let me,
I disagree with that. And I'll let you finish. I'll let you
okay.
finish. But let me just say that the Quran, the vast majority of it, can be understood by the ordinary person, the
So yeah,
vast
but
majority of
then
it.
now you
But
don't
there
know which
are
part
things,
you
yeah,
don't know which parts. Now you have to be able to judge which parts you can understand and which parts you can't understand. But here's the
no,
thing: if you can't trust somebody to understand the meaning behind these hidden meanings in the Quran, why then by that argument you shouldn't be able to trust them to recognize which scholar they should trust either. That seems like even a more complicated task for them to be able to judge which scholars are worthy of following. If they're not educated enough to decode the Quran
yeah.
according to you, they shouldn't be educated enough to be able to know which scholars are good.
Well, first of all, let me a fair point, which I believe I have a fair response to. But before I get to that, let me just first stress again that the vast majority of the Quran is can be understood by the ordinary person, and with a sound, ordinary intellect, and who's not coming to the Quran trying to read evil into it and justify his evil soul. The ordinary person who comes to the Quran will be able to understand it, will be able to benefit from it. Worship one God. Don't cut off relations with your family. Give charity. Pray. These are things that the ordinary person can understand, and be patient with hardship in this life, and so on. But when it comes to those that minority of issues, your question was, if I can characterize it correctly, was what was it again? Actually, I thought it was a really good point. I've just forgotten what it
I
was.
said, like, if somebody is not educated or intelligent enough
Yeah.
to see if these verses of the Quran mean, it seems like you
Yeah.
need even more credentials to be able to justify which scholars are the
So
good
so
scholar. Yeah.
yeah. So one of the main causes for the decline of Islamic civilization, as well as for the increase in the chaos that you're seeing in the Muslim world, is because of the decline of the scholars. With the decline of scholars, the decline of scholarship in Islam, and the decline and the loss of knowledge, and the following of people of ignorance, the spread of ignorance, the spread of misunderstanding of this religion, this is what has caused, this is what has allowed groups like ISIS, groups like Al Qaeda, these misunderstandings to come about. So in that point, what I do is actually agree with you in this.
Well,
Because this is why when there were legitimate and actually like qualified scholars dominated, then the correct understanding of this religion dominated. But when that began to be lost, then we see the spread of confusion and
I don't know.
deviation.
I don't think that. I think a lot of people in the modern day, when they watch ISIS or Al Qaeda or Taliban,
Mm.
they think everything is getting worse. But historically, actually, is everything is getting better. I don't. I don't. I think. I think as a per capita wise, I think Islam historically was worse than ISIS or Al Qaeda. These are, I mean, these ISIS and Al Qaeda as a percentage of the entire Muslim community, obviously don't represent as much of the Islamic community as much as they used to. And I think the reason why that's happening is because you have less scholars dedicating less people dedicating their lives into Islam, and more Muslims that are Muslim by name, but dedicating most of their lives to things other than Islam.
Well,
I mean,
let me just go ahead.
one thing that madrasas like. I mean, if you look at the so-called Muslim scientists or great thinkers of the golden the golden age of Islam, which I rather refer to it as the golden age of Arabs, because Islam had nothing to do with it. Is this point that Islam had nothing to do with it? They were doing science because they were scientists, not because they were Muslim. They were doing philosophy because they were philosophers, not because they were Muslim. It's just like any other rich empire at some point starts dedicating a lot of funds and resources to something. And the Arab Empire became very rich, so they dedicated a lot of funds to science and philosophy. so yeah, I don't think I think it's going the other way around. I think right now you're saying more people from the Islamic world, either abandoning Islam or ignoring Islam, and this is a sign of progress, I think. But
Well, I see it differently, of course. I mean, the way I see it is that this, the noble teachings of religion, belief, and character that and interaction with other human beings that predominated in ages past has been lost. And so absolutely the case that groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda are a very small minority in the Muslim world, and in fact are mostly universally hated. But nevertheless, they represent one symptom, one feature of the greater loss of authentic knowledge and understanding of this religion. And people, as far, I mean, I would disagree with your characterization of Islam of that predominated 500 years ago or 800 years ago as being worse than ISIS. I absolutely don't believe that. I think that ISIS
no,
is coming
I
with
think
something new that is never,
it's
you
a
know, has only been seen in the form of these crazy deviant
no,
groups.
all forms of religious nut jobs
Mm.
have their new way of looking at things, obviously.
Right.
But
Yeah.
so, what are your thoughts on ex-Muslim on apostates? Like, do you think don't you agree that there is a lot of Sahih hadith
Mm.
asking for killing people that used to be Muslim but now left Islam? That's pretty clear
Well,
cut, I think.
well, you're asking me, and I'm sure that you have heard the what you would consider to be the apologetic or apologetics answer to that.
Treason? Are you going to refer to treason? Is that what?
Right, right, and I will say that as well that I covered that in this the book that I held up, and also the person who wrote the introduction to that book, who's a well-known scholar, he covered that question as well. And I researched this in Arabic, okay, and I didn't just go and read some. This is what you should say to non-Muslims when they ask you about this. This book that I showed you is actually a book that is written for Muslims. It's not written for non-Muslims. It's written from a Muslim to another Muslim to
Oh, I'm
explain
going to
to
go
them.
read it just because it wasn't written for me. Okay.
No, I mean, it's secondary. The non-Muslims are a secondary audience. I mean, this book is primarily advice for
Right.
Muslims. Okay,
Okay.
what I mean, the reason I say that is that I want to make it clear that I am not primarily involved in trying to trying to give public relations type answers to non-Muslims. But what I'm actually primarily involved in is talking to other Muslims about this religion and
Right.
trying to help them. Okay, so what I would say to Muslims to explain this is that having studied this in Arabic and the commentaries on this issue is that it almost certainly is related to those who made war, changed their religion, and made
Oh,
war against the Muslims.
it
Now, let
doesn't
me.
say. It does not say that. It does
No,
not
no,
say that.
no, no,
Yeah.
no, no. But however, the scholars explained it that way. Not all scholars, but most
Muhammad did
scholars.
not explain it that way. That's the
No,
point.
no. But if you look at the context of this, and again, this context is very important. There are many people during the life of the Prophet who left Islam.
First of
Many
all,
people.
most scholars agree that yes, ex-Muslims should be put to death. I don't know where you're
Okay.
getting that number. Where you're getting that scholars from?
Well, read my book, and you'll see that I quoted classical scholars saying
Yeah, classical.
that.
So classical means the ones that I agree with you. But I'm just saying that. Do you agree that the most
Yeah.
scholars, maybe not scholars that you listen to, agree that
Mhm.
Islamic scholars, and I use the
Yeah.
word scholar loosely here,
Yeah.
but they agree that this is clear indication that if somebody is a Muslim and they leave Islam, they should be put to
Mhm.
death. That's their understanding of this verse.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true. It's certainly the case that scholars, classical scholars, held that in an Islamic polity or empire, that if someone leaves the religion and then goes about announcing it,
It doesn't
calling other
even say
people to
that.
leave it.
It says
No,
if
but that
just
is,
yeah, just
but
leaving
but
Islam is enough. Yeah.
well, yeah, but it's you can't leave it just like that. You have to look at the broader meaning of the circumstances. Why? Because there were many people who left Islam during the time of the Prophet. Not, I don't want to say many, but there were many examples of that. And so
Right.
did the Prophet Muhammad order? No, hold on a second. Did the Prophet Muhammad order all these people to be killed? No, he didn't. He ordered those to be killed who went and
He
not
wasn't
only did they
empowered
leave
at.
Islam.
He wasn't holding power yet.
No, but he ordered the people to be killed who not only left Islam but actually then began actively fighting against the Muslims and calling other people to fight against the Muslims. So the question is this: the question boils down to, did the Prophet mean when he said that kill the person who changes their religion? Did he mean the person who merely changes his belief from being a Muslim and he decides to be a Christian, he decides to be an idol worshiper, he decides, in and of itself, is that sufficient? And from my study of it, I don't see that was ever the case. I think, I believe that a person who decides that he doesn't believe in Islam, then there's no way to force someone to believe something that they don't believe. The
That's
real
not
the
what
real
that
issue,
the verse is not. The verse is
yeah,
not. Sorry, this hadith is not saying you can force them to be Muslim. The
right.
the hadith is saying you have to kill them, not because they should. You're forcing them to be Muslim. You just have to. That should be the punishment for leaving Islam.
And again, I'm going to say that my understanding of that hadith and the understanding that I have from reading scholars on this is that it does not apply to someone who simply changes their religion, but rather it applies to someone who goes out and begins to call against the religion and begins to incite people against the religion and begins. I do want to say that it's very important to keep in mind, and this is going to sound nonsensical to us because we live in
All right,
those of us who live in.
can I just
Yeah,
read some of
yeah,
this hadith just to see that
yeah,
what exactly so Allah's apostle, that means Rasulullah, that means Muhammad, right?
yeah,
He This is what he said. And this is Sahih Bukhari. And you
yeah.
agree with Sahih Bukhari? You think it's authentic? Can
Yeah,
we?
it is
Okay, so this is
authentic. Yeah,
authentic. Okay. So just to clarify for people, there are six main sources of hadith for Sunni Muslims, right? And
yeah,
two of them are the most authentic, are considered the most authentic ones, which is Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And this is Sahih Bukhari. So basically, these two books are the only thing that comes higher above these two books when it comes to authority in Islam and being authentic source of Islam is the Quran. After the Quran is basically Hadith, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim.
yeah.
So Muhammad said, the blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. So
Hmm.
basically that's a
Right,
long way of saying a Muslim, right?
right. That's
So
right.
okay. The blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped by Allah and that I am his apostle, so basically shahadat, cannot be shed except in three cases. So basically you should not be killing a Muslim other than three cases, right?
Yeah,
So in qisas for murder, so basically if somebody in paying blood money, I
but
guess, for basically
no.
no,
It means in retribution for
for
murder.
murder, basically. Okay, so if somebody kills somebody, you can kill them, and I think murder of another Muslim, to
But
be
no,
more
no.
okay.
But by the way, let
But
me
let me
say also that
let me
this
finish
this
this.
is
Yeah,
okay. All right. Yeah.
a married person who commits illegal sexual intercourse. So the first people were the people that commit murder. The second people were people that commit adultery, and
Hmm.
the third people and the one who reverts from Islam
Hmm.
and leaves the Muslims.
Yes.
It doesn't say that you have to be fighting Muslims back. It doesn't say that if they come and betray the Muslims or anything like that. Somebody that reverts from Islam. That's pretty much
Yeah,
it, right?
right. That is what that says. But
And
what I again
there are more
caution you
hadiths that confirm this. There are multiple hadiths. But yeah, go on.
that yeah. But what I have to caution you is this is the danger of selecting these hadith and taking them out of the broader context and understanding. So before you
Okay.
mock that as, I mean, because again, I mean, the first of all, there's another hadith that's other hadith that say someone who leaves the Islam, leaves the religion, and divides the jama'ah and divides the community, okay, and who splits from the community, so there what is being discussed there is the issue of essentially causing social chaos and disorder.
So you don't see this
So
you don't see this as problematic, though. You don't see this as this would have been, it would have been better. My religion would have been better if this was not here.
no, because this is coming in. This again has a certain context, and you can't take it out of context and say, for example, okay, so therefore I'm going to go and try to kill,
Just to be
someone,
clear, when you
try to
read
try to
hadith,
kill Armin Navabi, for example.
yeah, I mean,
You can't. That doesn't apply to this situation. It just doesn't
well,
apply.
if you want to kill me, there's a line for that.
I actually don't, and
no, I know.
I find this type.
Of course, I
Yeah,
didn't mean that. Of course,
yeah,
I don't think you
yeah.
are, right. So I'm just saying. I'm just referring to the people. There are many people that are trying to kill me, right?
Look, the point. Well, look,
But but
the people.
a lot of people
Yeah,
that are trying to kill me, they think they're justified, right?
yeah.
They
I'm
think they're
sure they
just
do. Yeah.
right. But because of shit like this, which I wish I was there was not there. But so when you say you have to look at it in context, I just want to explain to our audience
Mhm.
that when you read the Sahih Bukhari, there is no context for these things, right? Like if you want to read it in context, you have to get it from somewhere else. Like when you read it, it's not every hadith, every part of this hadith is about one thing, and then it jumps to something completely different. It's not like
Yeah,
this is part. Yeah, I agree with that, right? Like it's not like this is a part of a story
that's right.
that would makes it more clear if I read before and after of it. This is just a one piece of its own, sitting right there without anything before and after.
Yes,
Right.
that's correct, and
Yeah.
that's why Sahih Bukhari was not intended to be read by some novice in the religion. Yeah, it's not intended to be read that way by a Muslim or a non-Muslim. It's intended to be read by scholars, not by ordinary people. And this
Seems like
the
a
only
very inaccessible religion.
no, I mean the only reason that you're even able, or let's say ISIS is even able to distribute, these out of context verses and hadith is because of the existence of, say, for example, the printing press and the internet. And so in days past, which are very hard to conceive of because we have not lived in a time when this was the case. In older eras, people would not even have had access to these things. They would have had access only to a scholar who would have explained to them, the religion to them. But now that everyone, everything, technology has democratized everything. And people have access to this, and this opens up a realm of great disorder because people can just go and read these things and run with their interpretation of it, whether they're Muslims who are inclined to zeal
It
without understanding, or they're non-Muslims who look at it and say, "Oh, well, this is clearly a bad
it's
religion."
almost as if the religion was not meant to survive modern society, the
No,
modern
it's
world.
not. It's not that, but it's that the modern world has challenges in it that did not exist in previous times. I mean, there are we're living in an age that is very unique to human history in the sense of the technology, in the sense of the organization of human society, which is in large part due to that technology. So the reason I say all these things is that these new circumstances, it requires a great deal of qualified scholarship for Muslims to look at this body of their religion, the canon of their religion, and to explain this religion to the people living in these times. And because of the decline of Islamic scholarship, because of the decline of Islamic civilization, we do not have people qualified to do that. And instead, we have people who are journalists, we have people who are poets, we have people who are doctors, we have people who are engineers, And these people among the ordinary awam, the ordinary common people, have been able to pick up this religion's text and to interpret it in the way that they want to interpret it,
So
and in a way, so that's, and in a way that has, that has little relevance and bearing to the actual original goals and purposes and beauty of this religion. That's how I see the times we're living in.
sorry, I'm multitasking here, so I'm following
Yeah.
three different chats, live chats right now. So a question from the live chat from Beach. She's asking, before these were collected, who were they to be understood by? So I think she's saying before these hadiths. By the way, just to be clear, a lot of these hadiths were collected hundreds of years after, like the chain of narration, all that nonsense. But before you had all this, what were the Muslims supposed to do during that time?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, definitely, you didn't have the ability to go into a library or onto the internet and have access to hundreds of thousands of hadith. The ordinary person did not do that. Rather, they went to the mosque on Friday and heard lessons, or they went to their they went to after the prayer, then someone would come and get one of the someone of knowledge would give some advice, or a father would hand something down to their son. And these sayings and these teachings that are handed down, there are the fundamentals of this were understood by people. The problem that is arising is from texts. Again, it's from hadith and it's from verses that were that are from the minority of things, that are not from things that are clear. And people who have deviation in their heart, they're taking these things and they're magnifying them to overshadow the clear, simple, and noble teachings of this religion. Listen, I just want to tell you that if you were my neighbor, you would not find from me any hostility. You would find from me kindness. You would find from me charity. You would find from me politeness. You would find from me respect. You would find from me, maybe you and I would get together to work on some concern thing, for something happening in the neighborhood, or we would get together. I would have you over for dinner. You would have me over for dinner. Now, I would make it clear to you, and it would be clear if it were, if you asked, I would make it clear to you that I don't believe what you believe. And I would make sure that you knew that the reason I'm treating you in this way is because of my teachings, but I wouldn't oppress you. Now, the reason for that is not because simply that I'm a good person, and God willing, I am a good person, but it's because my ethics are informed and reinforced by my religion. And I don't go into my book and I go seek out something that gives me some excuse to oppress you and to treat you bad, and gives me some excuse to go and run over someone with a car or stab someone or blow someone. The only people who are doing that, who are going and looking for justifications to do that, are people who are sick in their soul. Okay, right. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I completely understand what I say, and I think I could very much get along with you and be friends with you, but and I think if I discover that you're a great person, I'm not going to give credit to Islam for that. I'm going to give credit to you for that.
I do hear you in what you're saying. But what I can say is that if Islam was something inherently evil, then it would have turned me into an evil person.
Not necessarily, because most Muslims I know are better than Islam, and most Muslims are so much better than Islam that they either ignore Islam or they try to create their own version of understanding of Islam to match their good personalities, right?
I would say that the other way to look at that is that most Muslims are their nature is in line with the pure and good teachings of this religion, and it's not in line with a distorted understanding of this religion. That's the other way, the flip side to it.
That's your understanding. But my understanding is that Islam is inherently evil, and most Muslims are not. Most Muslims are better than that, right?
But
Uh,
actually, and by the way, I have to remark on your, fairness and politeness in this discussion, even on the things that we disagree on. But I want to say that you fairly pointed out, and you said that there are things and teachings in this religion that could be characterized as supporting good character or whatever. So what I can say to you is that those things in this religion that are supporting good character, and that you recognize as supporting good character, you recognize that because of your inherent inborn inclination to what is good. And those things that you would reject as something evil, those are either things that you're having a misunderstanding on, or they're things that you yourself have some misunderstanding in your heart and character about. And I'll give you an example where you mentioned your disagreement with the golden rule, treating other people as the way that you want to be treated. And you understood that to mean that everyone has to be given the exact same thing or treated in the exact same way, that precise manner that I would wish to be treated. But that doesn't mean that. For example, if I invite you over to my house and I say, well, you know what, I like spaghetti, so therefore I'm going to make sure that Armin gets spaghetti too when I invite him over. And you're like, well, actually, I'm on a gluten-free diet. I'm like, no, I'm making sure that you eat what I eat. No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that if I were to be invited to your house, I would hope to be given some food that that I would enjoy. And so therefore, if I'm going to invite you to my house, I'm going to make sure that you're given some kind of food that you enjoy. So that's what that means. It does.
that's what you.
I
That's
want to.
what you mean. That's what you mean. I'm just
But that's
saying
what
there's
everyone. That's what everyone. That's what
no,
everyone understood this religion. I
no.
mean, this principle to me,
I
and
mean,
this principle is something
okay.
that all sound. Look,
I'm
even
just saying
Buddhism,
there's not
which
much. I'm just saying
yeah.
there's not that much to the good parts, right? There's not that
But there
much.
is.
There's not much
Maybe
nuance to it. There's not much explanation. There's not much.
it's true. You're right. You're absolutely right. There's not. It's
Right.
because it's not necessary. Because
Oh,
it's not necessary to have reams and reams of commentary on those things that are pure and simple and clear. Where all of the disagreement comes about are on in those areas that are unclear. And we don't want to. We can't. If people focus on only what is unclear and which lends itself to interpretations that are unhealthy and unsound, then you're going to wind up with that's your religion is going to be just a collection of distorted understandings of some, or exaggerated understandings of some unclear verses and unclear statements, and you're going to be ignoring that body of the religion that is teaching us to live in harmony with one another, and to live in
um,
and to live with respect with one another.
well, I don't agree with that, but we could go on talking about
Okay.
that forever. But I mean,
All right.
I have some other hadith examples
Yeah.
that are ridiculous, but I don't want to know if we want to go over that. Like, I just to give it an understanding, most people when they have a problem with Islam, they talk about the violent parts, right? But
Yeah.
I don't even see the main cause of Islam to be violence and terrorism. I see the main cause of Islam and other religions to be diverging resources to things that are not helpful, to monopolizing certain needs that human has and reducing competition to it when it comes to our desire for community, for a desire to be
Right.
significant, for desire for purpose. But there's, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the thing is that if anybody just reads all of the hadith, all of Bukhari and all of Muslim, I would be surprised if they don't come out and say like, okay, that was batshit crazy. Just to give an understanding, like there are parts of the hadith that tells you, I don't know if you know about this, that there's if every fly has on each of its wings, right? It has poison on it and poison on it, and the other fly. So every fly, the two wings of a fly,
Yeah.
one wing has poison on it, and the other wing has the cure to that poison on it. So if a
Mm-hmm.
fly falls into your drink, make sure you dip it fully, so that if you got the poison in your drink,
Mm-hmm.
you also get the cure for that poison in your drink before you drink it.
Right.
Right, and we know that's absolute nonsense. There are verses that tells you
Well,
to
if you don't mind, if I could just stop you there.
right.
Now, let me just say that I don't know with respect to that exact hadith. I haven't studied that, and I don't know what the interpretation of that is. But I do want to say this. I want to say that there is for those things that we can't wrap our heads around.
Hmm.
There are interpretations of those things that we need to go and seek out, and either there will be something that that will make sense to us, or it will be something that that we don't fully understand, but we can say to ourselves that this is something, some knowledge of the unseen that we didn't have. Did it mean, is that literal? Is that figurative? I don't know what the answer is with respect to
Or
that.
it might be,
Indeed,
it might be that
but
is
my
nonsense, right? Can you at least agree with that?
if no, because if the prophet said it, it's not nonsense,
Oh, that's the problem with religion. That's the summary of the problem with religion, right? So something that is nonsense. Well, the definition of something not being nonsense is that if the prophet says it, it can't be nonsense, right? That's
right.
basically excusing
Now,
religion
my
excusing
right. I
nonsense,
mean, my understanding of it might be nonsense,
right?
but in
Yeah,
and of itself,
right.
in the sense that it's true, it's not nonsense.
All right, but okay. So we did. I'm
Yeah.
gonna read some questions from our live chat, but and before I
Sure.
do that, there was one thing that everybody kept on wanting me to ask you,
Yeah.
but I wanted to leave that at the end. What made you go from atheism to Islam?
So, as I mentioned, that I just didn't feel that I didn't feel like I was on solid ground. I felt that I was standing on nothing. I felt that I didn't have. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was smoking weed one day, and I used to smoke a lot of weed. And I'd say I thought to myself, is this right or wrong? I mean, I actually don't know. I mean, like I would have been able to answer that when I was Catholic, but I didn't know if it was right or wrong. And that's just, it's the sort of thing that made me think, like, you know, if I don't have any, like, sort of belief in anything, then I have really nothing to stand on. I have no premises. I have no axioms. I have no. If I have nothing like that, then I can't draw any conclusions from anything. And so another thing is that I began to feel like as well, like, where are we going? I mean, what is the purpose of living? Why are we on this earth? And I was listening at the time to a lot of reggae music, and of course, in reggae, there's some weird ideas about Haile Selassie and so on and so on. But in general, they're quoting a lot from the Bible. And I used to listen to a song that used to basically, it was just a psalm, from the Bible and from the Old Testament, set to music, and it was very beautiful, and it reminded me in my heart of the time when I used to be in church, praying, and I felt God's presence. I used to feel God's presence, and I felt that there was some, larger power, that God was listening to me and heard me, and I felt comfort in that. And so when I uh, when I got to be about 19, I missed that feeling, and I decided that I would go, and I went and tried the door of a church that I used to go to, and the door was closed. I went at a time that it wasn't actually even open, but and then I started reading the Bible again, and I met a guy who was a Muslim, and he gave me a copy of the Quran to read. And when I read it, and I found that most of the content of it was very familiar to me, as a Christian. Having been a Christian, the stories of Moses, the stories of Abraham, which, as you know, and Noah, as you know, make up most of the the stories that are in the Quran. And then the descriptions of God, and His nature. Those things were not things that were foreign to me. The only, what I actually really liked about the Quran and about Islam was the explanation of Jesus as being a prophet of God, and yes, born of a miraculous birth, but not being God's son, and not being God Himself. So to me, that actually made a lot of sense, because having loved Jesus, grown up being taught to love Jesus, and having still this positive feeling for Jesus in my mind, Islam allowed me to accept Jesus as being a miraculous figure, but not as God Himself. And when I was younger and being a Catholic, I had a very hard time with the Trinity, and this is one of the reasons that I wound up leaving Catholicism, because I just couldn't understand the Trinity. It just didn't resonate and make sense to me. But so when I became Muslim, I said, okay, this is one God. This is the religion taught by Abraham. In my mind, this group of Jews, in the desert, um, was visited by angels and did have a connection with their Lord. And this group of descendants from these patriarchs, these prophets, did have a mission to bring all of humanity to the worship of one God and to good treatment of one another. And I believe, I believe in it. And I was sitting in the park one day, and I was, looking at a bird, and the bird was singing. And my friend, who was a Muslim, he said to me, he said, "Do you see that bird?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That bird, you can have the peace that that bird has, because that bird does what God created it for. That bird does what God intended for it, and that's what a Muslim means. It means one who submits to what God wills for the human. And we have the choice to do that. That bird doesn't have that choice because that's what he was created to do, but he wasn't created with the choice to follow or not follow. But we have that choice. We have a limited choice, of course, because we're beholden to other laws that, like gravity and, lifespans and entropy and so on. But we do have a choice when it comes to whether or not we're going to believe in God or not believe in God. And that, when he said that to me, it reminded me that I did believe in God. And so it wasn't so much an argument from design and so on, but rather it was just a reminder to me that I did believe in God, and that I loved him, and that's what I believe.
So, based on what you said, would you not agree that basically it was an emotional appeal rather than a logical one?
I think that it was there's an emotional aspect to it, and there's a intuitive aspect to it, but it's certainly there's, I don't believe that there's any way to, like, quote unquote prove that God exists, because there are alternative explanations. I don't think the alternative explanations are convincing, because I believe that it's so unlikely that there would be an Earth that was such and such amount away from a sun that was such and such an age.
Oh my God, you're opening a Pandora's box that I
right,
would
right.
get,
No,
I would get
no,
into it. Yeah. All right.
I don't actually, by mentioning that, I don't mean by that to say that this somehow proves it, proves God's existence. All I mean to say is that, one can. I also don't believe that there's any way to.
I should send you a copy of my book, Why There Is No God.
I downloaded it and I read it. And
oh, you read it?
Yeah, and frankly, I mean, these arguments and
well, thank you for reading it. That's impressive.
The arguments in that I dealt with in philosophy 101. I don't mean to say that to disparage your book, because you put a lot of thought into it. Actually, what I'm going to say to you, I'll say to you the way that my philosophy class went to, because I took this class about 6 months after becoming a Muslim. And to me, the teacher came in and he said, "Okay, I'm going to prove to you by the end of this class that God does not exist." And he came in, what he did was he set out to disprove the so-called proofs that had been advanced by Aquinas and others for the existence of God. But for me, over and over and over again, the failure of proofs of Aquinas and others, does not equate to proof that God does not exist.
No, no, that's not the claim, though. The claim is that you shouldn't believe in something there's no evidence for.
Right. I understand.
You understand it, right? Okay. Yeah. You understand the burden of proof and all that, right?
Yes, but actually the burden of proof is a sound principle when it comes to many things. For example, criminal law and so on and so on. But when it comes to something like whether or not there exists something transcendent above this physical world, then you either believe it or you don't believe it. You either
because something is transcendent, that doesn't shift the burden of proof.
No, but the fact, right. But the principle that one has to prove that God exists is itself, something that you have to prove. So, I don't see any necessity for the burden of proof being on the one who believes in God to prove that God exists, because anyway, that's impossible. You can't prove from the physical that something metaphysical exists. So
All right. Yeah, I
I think
agree.
it's feasible.
I agree that it's impossible. That's why we don't believe it.
Yeah,
But can
but then you have to explain why there's some necessity to prove it. You see what I'm saying? You've actually already destroyed by this is begging the question. You're begging the question by saying,
no?
first of all, you have to prove that the burden of proof is on the one making the claim when it comes to the existence of the metaphysical. You can't prove the existence of the metaphysical, therefore you can't, therefore you lose. I mean that's actually question
Wait,
begging.
how's that begging a question? I'm
It's
not trying
begging the
to.
question
Yeah.
because you've already assumed what you're trying to prove.
No,
You've
I
already
didn't
assumed.
assume. I didn't assume anything. I'm saying like I didn't assume there is no God. I'm saying I will believe in a God as soon as you give me an evidence. I
No,
didn't assume I didn't assume anything. I'm saying I can't believe in things without evidence. Like
right? Why not?
that. Well, can you believe in anything else that I come up with right now that without evidence? I mean, based on that argument, Hinduism is right, Christianity is right, Islam is right, Judaism is right, Scientology is right, homeopathy is right. I mean,
No,
all of
no,
this all of
because
a sudden becomes becomes real because if you
no,
shift.
no, because there are ways to disprove metaphysical claims with respect to other metaphysical claims, but there's no way to prove from physical evidence whether there is or is not a something transcendent above it. So therefore, what you wind up doing is you wind up saying either there is a burden of proof to do that, or there isn't one. And what I say is that if I have the axiom that God exists, and then I proceed from there, then that explains to me my existence. It explains to me my soul. It explains to me many things. And
But that doesn't
you
make it real, right?
right, okay, but and that's why that if there had been some way to prove from the physical that something metaphysical existed, such as God, then it wouldn't be faith. It would just be a matter of doing some
Okay, so when you
equations
say it
or.
wouldn't be faith if there was a way, that means that you're agreeing that it's not based on logic, it's based on something other than logic.
No, I say that it's based on it's an axiom. It's something that you assume to be true, and
With no
it's
good,
something that you have
it's
faith
something
in.
that you assume to be true with no good reason.
I actually have a reason, and the reason is intuition, and the reason is not only intuition
Oh,
but
that's not a
also
very good source of knowledge.
well, that's where we differ, and
But
that's what makes human beings differ, and they will always differ. And so you and I
right.
differ in that way. For me, it is a good reason to believe. See, not only is it my intuition, and I just want to mention Augustine, and he said something very beautiful. Even though I'm a Muslim, I agree with him on this very much, which is that we really are never taught anything, but we are reminded of things that we already know, and that's what Plato said as well. And I do agree with that. I agree that I believe that we are born with a certain nature and with knowledge, and that we in our lives we
Yeah,
forget those things and are distant from those things. And so for example, if you say to me, hey, 2 and 2 is 5. And I sit there and I'm like, well, wait a minute, hold on. And I say, no, you're wrong about that. So in that sense, I sit in judgment over
you're
you.
using logic over there. But
Right. Okay. Anyway, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah,
I'm sorry.
no, you were just saying something. What you just said before this? Before
Well,
two and two.
I was just
I
saying
just
that
wanted.
there's no. I was just saying that I agree with you that there's no actual
Hmm.
way to prove from the non-physical. I mean, from the physical that the
Right.
metaphysical exists.
Uh,
And some Muslims might disagree with me,
okay.
and I'm just saying this from my own understanding. And God forgive me if
Okay.
I've gotten that wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna just say one last thing, and then I'm gonna go to some of the live chat questions, and we need
Yes,
responses
sir.
sort of fast because we've been gotten way
Yes,
too
sir.
long. So I have one question,
Yeah.
and then I'll go to the live chat question. So you were a Catholic,
Yeah.
then you decided that that's wrong, and you became an atheist, and then you decided that that's wrong, and you became a Muslim.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay. So you already thought that you were wrong twice,
Hmm.
right? Is there any chance that you're wrong now?
There's no chance.
There's no chance.
There's no chance that I'm wrong. The reason there's no chance that I'm wrong is that what I believe now is what I believed when I was as far back as I can remember. You know, when I was a child, my mother told me a story which I vaguely remember. Of course, I don't know if I actually remember this or if I just remember having once remembered this. But you know, she told me a story of when I was about 2 years old and I built or three, and I built a pile of leaves, and I asked my mom, and I stood on top of the pile of leaves, and I asked my mom, if I build this pile of leaves high enough, can I see God? And someone would say, oh, well, you were 3 years old and your mom was already teaching you about God's existence and so on and so on. But no, I believe that when I left when I left Catholicism, when I left Christianity, I left something of the truth. I don't believe that Catholicism is true entirely, but I believe that it has something of the truth. And when I left that and I fell into atheism, I believe that I went into a dark period of ignorance and of loss. And I believe that, and darkness. And I believe that when I realized again that in fact God does exist and that he has a plan for us and that he's merciful and he is, he's all wise and he is the Most High and these things, then I reverted back to what I was upon when I was created. So I don't believe that there's even the slightest chance that I'm wrong. I actually doubt, since we are, and this is again back into philosophy, but I believe that since we are contingent beings, I actually doubt my own existence more than I doubt God's existence. I don't have the slightest doubt that I could be wrong.
Okay, I have, I think, 6 questions that I collected from live chat. Some of the questions that people came in later asked. This is the YouTube live chat, by the way. Facebook live chat people. I try to see. Anyways, but I need really quick responses to this. If I didn't if I didn't collect some questions from the live chat, it's because Muscal is because we already covered it earlier. That's why I didn't put the question there. Anyways, so. First question: What is his justification for Eid al-Adha, which is an animal slaughter of animals? By the way, in Iran we call it Eid Qurban, which is an animal slaughter of animals for religious reasons. So, really quick responses to these.
Well, when we slaughter these animals, they're supposed to go to the poor. So. This is feeding the poor, and it's giving it's buying an animal from our own wealth that we're giving up money and we're feeding the poor. So I don't really see any, unless someone has ethical issues with the slaughter of animals. I will say that the ethics and when it comes to the way that animals are supposed to be slaughtered are not always followed, and that's regretful. But that's deviating from what is supposed to be, and it's not actually what's supposed to be.
Okay, second question. May you please ask your guest if he thinks Islam is a religion of peace?
Well, I don't think that's a simplistic thing to say. I mean, I think that in Islam, the default is peace. Islam, the default is that we're supposed to seek peace. But at the same time, if someone tries to rob me and I fight back, then that's not peaceful. But, at the same, that doesn't mean that that the filthy actions of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on are justified ever in any way. I think that people and nations have the right to engage in just war, but those are under lawful conditions. And I think even probably you would agree that violence is justified in some situations.
3. By the way, I'm not dismissing Facebook people. I just haven't figured out a way to put your live chat on the screen. I will figure that out. I'm reading your comments, so I'm not dismissing you guys. I love you all. Okay, so.
I love you too.
So, third question: If Islam has been just handed down by scholars, then how do they claim that it hasn't been interpreted even a bit?
Well, I mean, Islam has been interpreted, and it has to be interpreted. It has to be explained to us by people who know the religion and have better knowledge than we do, especially when it comes to those things that are not obvious and clear. So I don't know who claims that it hasn't been interpreted. I think what they might mean is that it hasn't been changed, and I actually think that, in fact, to the extent that there, to a great extent, the proper understanding of this religion has been lost among many people, or has been distorted among many people, and it's our job as Muslims to recover that proper understanding.
Fourth question. By the way, I did. A lot of people are going to be like, "Why are you not pushing back on this?" Because we're running out of time. I just want to make sure we're reading some of the live chat questions. Question number 4: for your guests, what does believing and practicing Islam get you that you couldn't get from being raised Catholic? It continues. I was raised Catholic, but now I'm an atheist. Okay, go on.
Yeah, I believe that the ethical teachings of the Bible are nearly in line with the ethical teachings of Islam, except with respect to certain details. I think that they're very, very fine. I would say with respect to my relations with other human beings, almost all of us agree in almost every respect with how we're supposed to treat other human beings. Where our differences are in our understanding of the nature of God.
Okay, so fifth question is, can he not have, actually this is my favorite question, can he not have figured out living in harmony without a book, like without Islam, I think?
I think that's also a very good question, and I think that there are people who can do that, and there are people who are able to live in a society and say, all right, well, society is doing X, Y, Z, but that's clearly wrong because their heart finds that repulsive and repugnant, and they are drawn to what is good. I do hope that I would have been able to find that guidance without it. But what I benefit from this, the way I benefit from this book is that this Quran and this book is what God wanted and intended for humanity to follow, and it doesn't leave anything out, and it doesn't leave things to it doesn't leave anything out in terms of my code of conduct with other human beings, or in what I need to know to worship God and follow Him.
The last one is actually more of a comment than a question. It says, if a child grows up without the concept of God, he won't believe in God.
I think that I understand where that question is coming from, and I think that's obviously very debatable, and people have argued about that a great deal. I actually happen to believe that a person will believe in God if they've grown up without being taught that. But
just to be fair to the Facebook, I'm just going to read something from Erin. She's saying he's saying that he needs this to be good. Is he saying he's inherently bad without religion? Are you inherently bad without religion?
No. I think I was misunderstood. I'm not saying that that I personally would have been a bad person if I hadn't read this book. But what I can say is that by reading, there are people. By the way, there are people who are born whose character tends towards being evil. That's their tendency towards those things. And so for those people, they have to do a great deal of self, of watching themselves very, very closely. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, every single one of us is born with an inclination to do evil, just in the same way that we're born with an inherent, knowledge of what is right, actually deep down. And so what this book does is it reminds us. It's one of the names of the Quran is the reminder. It reminds us of what we know to be good, and it reminds us of what we know to be bad. And so in that way, it's a reminder, and it's a framework. And for those people who are not inclined to do good, then I think it's necessary for them, but it's also necessary for us, because all of us will tend to stray without that reminder.
Right. By the way, that was the last one. I just want to note that a lot of people that joined the chat halfway through, they ask which one of us is the Muslim and which one of us is the atheist. And I think it's very interesting, because I'm the Iranian Middle Eastern guy that is an atheist, and you're the white guy from American that is the Muslim. So I think we're both breaking stereotypes here.
I would love to meet you one day, and maybe it'll be two Muslims.
Right? Yeah, we'll have not well, or maybe two atheists. We don't know. But the thing is that what we're showing is that we don't have to agree to be able to have dialogue and be
That's right.
and be able to disagree with each other. passionately disagree with each other. Like we don't see eye to eye on many things, and we are very much. I mean, I would say I'm fighting Islam. I am fighting Islam, and it's an idea. And I think you would. It would be fair for you to say that you're fighting atheism, right?
I think that what you're fighting is a misunderstanding of Islam.
Yeah, but
So
my understanding is that I'm fighting Islam. Okay, so
okay, all right.
but what I'm saying is that we can be passionately fighting each other's ideas and still be able to have a dialogue and have a conversation and be friendly
Abs-
to each and even get along. Yeah, go on.
Absolutely. And I would say that, first of all, let me say this very clearly, that any Muslim who has ever or was thinking about ever sending you some sort of threat or even, God forbid, acting on it, you're wrong for that. You need to check yourself. You need to understand your religion better. So I say to you that this is I'm grateful for the opportunity to have come on your show. I'm grateful for your hospitality and for your respect and politeness and
Right, and I also want to give you credit for actually coming and talking to people that you disagree with, coming at people that are the exact opposite of where your position is,
yes,
and
sir.
a lot of people have this idea that you can't talk to Muslims because they don't want to talk to you, but if you criticize them, I think like they're no, a lot of them are not. It's not like that sensitive. Like they can handle a criticism, they can
Well,
handle attacking.
unfortunately, there are many Muslims who can't handle that, and I think that's another way in which they misunderstand their religion. They
Right.
need to people need to be able to to handle the fact that there are people who don't understand them, who don't agree with them, and that's life. They need to be able to handle that and stop being so sensitive.
Right. So, and another thing is that the point of this conversation is that even if we move away and you did not change my opinion on a single thing, and if I didn't change your opinion on a single thing, this is still not a loss because I think the first goal of these conversations is to demonstrate how far apart ideologically two people can be and still befriend each other, right? And still get
I
along.
agree with that. Yeah,
And if
I
we
agree.
could finish, like if we could have a conversation in a friendly way and be civilized about it, I think that demonstration by itself has achieved the goal, has shown to people that look, we could still fight each other's ideas. The more we fight each other's ideas, the less we are fighting each other personally, right?
I agree. I
Right.
agree 100%.
All right. Well, and that we
Yeah.
agree. Anyways, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for everybody in the live chat. Where can people find your work and your book and read your articles and stuff like that? I almost forgot about that. I almost
Yeah,
forgot.
so you can see my Twitter handle there. I've actually now retired from Twitter,
But the links are
but I'm
there. Yeah.
yeah, but I'm leaving the account up so anyone can go to that. And I also have a blog, agoodtree.net. That's AGOODTREE.net. That is a collection of all my writings going back to maybe 2002. Not all my writings, but I filtered out the ones that I don't agree with anymore.
That's
So
a
anyway.
goodtree.com or
Net.
.net, a
Yeah.
goodtree.net. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and your book was again
The book is Pakistan's
Pakistan's
blasphemy
blasphemy law
law and
and
non-Muslims,
non-Muslim by Ismail
and
Royer.
the link to that can be found on my blog, goodtree.net.
Okay, okay. I'll put a link in the description. Once this live chat is over, I'll put a link in the description to your blog as well.
Yes, sir. Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Thank you very much.
Anyway, thank you everybody. Thank you, and stop streaming. Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
listeners. Appreciate
Bye.
it.